Hey guys, it's AC. Welcome to my house, and today we're going to talk about whether you should buy a property that already has a tenant in place. Well, when you're out house shopping, you usually come across three scenarios. One, the house is already vacant and you buy it that way. Two, someone's living in the home, but they will vacate prior to closing. Or three, there's a tenant and a signed active lease in place, which conveys with the property, which means when you buy the property, you have to honor the lease that's already in place. Now I'm going to run through the pros and cons of that last opportunity of buying a property that has a tenant in place. The first pro for me is that it's not going to be vacant when you buy, right? The day of closing, you already have a tenant in place. You're already collecting rent money. There's nothing to worry about. You don't have to take photos. You don't have to market it. You don't have to do anything. A tenant's already living there, and that's great. That's a huge pro. If you're real estate investing and you're just starting out and every dollar counts, well, a vacancy can be very painful at the beginning of a rental property, so this takes that worry away. A second pro is you know exactly what it rents for. A lot of times, a lot of the worries for first-time real estate investors is buying a home and you're not exactly sure what you can get for it on the rental market. You have an idea, you've done your research, but of course, you don't really know until you actually market it and try to go get a tenant. And the amount you get could be variable based on the month you're trying to rent it. Summer and spring usually rents for higher than winter and fall lease renewals. So this is a concern. And if you have a lease in place and a tenant's already paying, well, you know what the bottom is. You know, no matter what, you can rent it for this. Maybe it's under market rent, sure, but you know you can get this rent because there's already a rent. You have historic, accurate data, what this specific home rents for in this market, and the sky's the limit. You can go up from there. You don't have to worry about going below that rent amount. So that's another worry slayed with having a tenant already in place. Third is if you have a tenant that's been living there long term. When I say long term, I think maybe 3 years or more. Chances are that tenant wants to stay another 3 years or more. If they've been there 10 years, they probably want to be there another 10 years. They feel comfortable in this home. It is their home. It's not just a rental to them. They've created memories for themselves in this house, and they'll probably want to stay there for long term. So again, this takes away the vacancy worry in the future. You probably have a long-term stable tenant, and that's great news, and one of the best reasons for buying a house that already has a tenant in place. The fourth pro I have on my list is the house is in livable condition. We have a tenant who's accepted living there. We know it doesn't need a new countertop or a kitchen remodel or any sort of expenses that needs to go into it on day one. Maybe you still want to do these things. Maybe it needs some freshening up, but the tenant is fine, most likely with the condition in the home that it's in. Now, this can vary. It could be that the landlord is selling because the house needs a major fix and doesn't have the money to do it, so they're going to sell it. And that is going to be something that you have to deal with as a new landlord, but that will be disclosed to you at the time of purchase, or it will be discovered during your due diligence period. But typically, we know that the condition of the home is livable, it's safe, someone doesn't mind living there. Now, there are scenarios where this is not the case, like I said, but typically it means the home is in rentable condition. That is great, because a lot of new investors love spending money on renovating a house, and I mean over-renovating the house. I know so many new-time investors who want to just make everything so nice and so clean and almost make it like they want to live in the property, even though they're not going to live in it and they're going to rent it to someone else who probably won't appreciate those custom touches that a new landlord just put into the home, and they're not going to pay for it either. A lot of the times the extra wainscoting or the shiplap doesn't mean you're going to get extra rent. It does look prettier in photos. It does probably appeal to you, but it doesn't necessarily translate to appealing for rental tenants who may just be looking at the property as a transitional period of their life, and they just want something that they can get in, live in for a year or two, and move out, and they're not going to treat it with the love and condition like you would as a homeowner. So this sort of prevents you from over renovating the property on day one because there's a tenant in place already and you don't want to disrupt them. And we already know they're okay with the livable conditions of the property. And you could work with them to maybe fix up some things if you've already recognized that there's been delayed or deferred maintenance on the home. But overall, this sort of prevents you from overspending on a renovation. So that is one of my favorite pros for buying a property that has a tenant in place. This brings me to my last pro. When you buy a rental property with a tenant in place, at the closing table, you automatically get transferred their security deposit and their prorated rent for the rest of the month. There's no first time interaction with the tenant saying, hey, I'm your new landlord, pay me this way or that way. At the closing, the previous landlord pays you for the remainder of that month's rent and transfers the security deposit. So your first interaction with your tenants is a very positive one. You reach out and say, hey, welcome, I'm your new landlord. I've already collected your rent and your security deposit from your previous landlord. We're good there. Moving forward, this is how I would like to be paid in rent. So you know your lease is going to be honored, the lease we already have in place, and we'll just continue with the terms that way. It's a great neutral way to start a relationship with a tenant, and it really kind of makes the transition seamless. Now, it's not all chocolate and roses when we buy a property with a tenant in place. I'd like to cover the cons now. Con number one, well, you're bound by those lease terms. Possibly it's a poorly written lease. Maybe the lease terms are way below market rate. Maybe there was not a security deposit collected. Well, you really have to read through those lease terms to understand what you're agreeing to when you buy the property. And if you don't like those lease terms, there's really nothing you can do until that lease expires, and then you come up with a new lease for this tenant. And they can choose to stay with your lease terms, or they can move out. Con number two, we didn't screen this tenant. We don't get to see their credit score or their rental application, if there even was one. Possibly they've had evictions on their record that we're not aware of. This is sort of the honor system here. Hey, I'm going to trust the landlord did the appropriate screening before they filled this house with this tenant. Sometimes that's not the best way to buy a property. There is a slight risk in that situation. Another con is we don't know the payment history of this tenant. I like to ask the seller for the last 6 months of rent receipts so that they can prove that this tenant paid on time and at the amount that they paid. Sometimes the seller has this record, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's a forged record, to be honestly. If you have a tenant paying in cash, I've bought a house where the seller was actually the one depositing the cash on behalf of the tenant and saying, oh, it's his tenant paying me in cash. And of course, you don't learn this after you buy the property and realize the tenant hasn't paid cash, and then I have to deal with the eviction or working out a system to keep that tenant in place. All this to say, there is some risk inheriting a tenant, even if the landlord provides documents saying they're a great tenant. Another con is we don't know what handshake agreements or verbal agreements occurred between the previous landlord and the tenant. Now, you're only bound to what's written in the lease, but many times you come in and you start changing the rules and saying, I don't want you parking on the front lawn anymore. And that's when the tenant's saying, well, the previous landlord was cool with it. He said I could do it. And he said I could do it with my friends too. That's why I have 3 cars out there. And you as a landlord are in your complete right to say if it's not in the lease, it's not true. And I just want to let you know there'll be some difficult conversations you're going to have right up front about these handshake verbal agreements that may or may not have existed with the prior landlord. And you just got to come in and enforce your new rules and really just stick by the lease. And that way there's no argument. If it's not in the lease, then you don't abide by it. If it is in the lease, you do. And finally, my last con for buying a property that has a tenant is that if you do have to evict them or end their lease or prematurely find a way to get them to exit your home, cash for keys, which is just sort of a way of saying, I'm going to pay you to move out. Well, that's another expense right after you bought a house to get the tenant out. And then maybe you have to do repairs or renovations or repaint or do something along those lines before you can actually take photos and then market it. And well, this just drags things out. If you would have bought it vacant, you could have probably gotten on the rental market within a week. And you need that tenant to leave before you can do what you need to do, before you market it, before you list it. Well, you could easily burn through 2-3 months right up front without any rental income before you can find that new tenant to sign a 12-month lease. So there you go. There's no right or wrong way to buy a property. Some, you might not even have a choice. You just love the house, you love the price, you love the location, and you'll deal with the tenant or not deal with the tenant. It doesn't matter because the house itself or the deal itself speaks to you and you want to move on it. I wouldn't say avoid a property with a tenant. I wouldn't say only buy properties that are vacant. It really is a case-by-case scenario. Sometimes it's in your best interest to have a tenant, sometimes it's not, and sometimes you don't know that choice till after you bought the property. So I just want to say, roll with the punches. It shouldn't be a deal breaker. It shouldn't be a requirement. You're going to have some properties that are great. You're going to have some previous tenants that are bad, and it's just a numbers game. And it's a business. It's going to have its ups and downs. So just roll with the punches and just buy the house because you like the numbers, what you think you can rent it for. And if the tenant's in place, great. But again, not a deal breaker either way. If you like this video, please like and subscribe right now. I need your love. I need your YouTube love. Please tell me in the comments what you think and your experiences with having a tenant in place. If you want more information on real estate investing or house fire, check out thehouseofac.com or my new book, House Fire. And FIRE stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. If these are your goals, doing it through rental houses is really the fastest and the safest and the most lucrative way of doing it. More info at thehouseofac.com. Thanks for checking out my channel, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.